Welcome to another advanced photography topic called exposure compensation. By now, you understand that when in manual mode, you can increase or decrease your exposure whenever you'd like. This allows you to shoot more creative shots in terms of exposure. But what about if you are shooting with an automatic mode and your photos are always coming out too dark or too bright for your taste? Or maybe they're perfectly balanced and you want it to be a bit brighter or darker. That's where exposure compensation comes into play. Where do you find the exposure compensation option? In most cases, your camera will have a little button with a plus or minus on it. You can press that button to turn the dial to increase or decrease the setting. Some cameras have a separate dial for exposure compensation altogether. Adjusting this will make your photos brighter or darker. How does exposure compensation change the exposure? Is it aperture, shutter speed, ISO, or what? Well, this depends on what automatic mode you're on in your camera. Program, aperture priority, shutter priority, one of these. We explain these modes in the camera anatomy section of this course. So go ahead and skip to that lesson if you need to. In aperture priority mode, the exposure compensation changes the shutter speed. In shutter priority, it changes the aperture. In program mode, it changes the shutter speed. What about in manual mode though? Well, it doesn't make sense to use exposure compensation in manual because you can choose any of your settings to adjust your exposure. Let's see when and why we would use this option in a quick real-world demonstration.
Okay, so we're here and we're inside a living room and I have Sam up against a really bright window and we're gonna use exposure compensation. Now let's say I want to take a picture of Sam in front of the window. I've got my Fuji X-T2 here. I'm at ISO 1600. I'm on aperture priority at an f2, so that means the camera is going to pick its own shutter. So let's go ahead and take a picture with exposure compensation just set to 0. Bam. Okay, cool. So I got a picture of Sam here. He's totally silhouetted because our evaluative metering is looking to expose the entire frame, and it's exposing for the outside, which is so bright, whereas on the inside it's very dark. Now I don't really care about the background blowing out and I want to bring up the exposure, but I want to stay in aperture priority because I'm going to be shooting a bunch of stuff inside with Sam. So I'm going to bump my exposure compensation up by, let's try 2 stops. So now I'm telling the camera I want it to be 2 stops brighter so it can choose what it needs to choose. The last image, aperture priority, it shows a 4400th of a second to take it at. So let's go ahead and see what it chooses now with exposure compensation set to +2. All right, and here we go. See how Sam is much brighter. The camera in aperture priority now chose a 900th of a second for compensating for that exposure, basically. Let's do +3 and add a little bit more. So now that's way bright. Basically, I've told the camera that I want it to be 3 stops higher, and it shows a 1/50th of a second. Everything else stays the same. And you can see now that the brightness in the photo allows me to see inside and Sam. The background's totally blown out. And this is a very quick and easy way to use exposure compensation in a practical situation.